Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're diving deep into India's labor force.
Oh, cool.
And we're going to be focusing on a report called the Periodic Labor Force Survey Annual Report. And this is the 2023-24 report from their National Sample Survey Office. So
It's comprehensive.
it is.
Yeah.
This deep dive should help you understand the current state of India's workforce.
Yeah.
Because they really went all out with this report.
Interesting.
They tracked over 1.7 million people
Wow.
across both rural and urban India
Oh, okay.
for a whole year.
That's impressive. That's a massive undertaking.
Yeah, it's a really incredible data set. And
So what kinds of things does it look at?
so it gives us a really detailed snapshot of employment, unemployment earnings, and a lot more.
Okay.
And it's really crucial.
So we can see, like, I guess the big picture of
Yeah.
what's going on in India.
Exactly.
Okay.
Because it gives us insight into the Indian economy, social trends, and policy decisions
Gotcha.
that are affecting millions of lives.
Okay.
Right off the bat, I noticed that they're using two different ways to measure employment.
Oh, okay.
They have usual status, and they have current weekly status. And it seems a little redundant, doesn't it?
Well, it might seem that way at first glance, but I
Yeah.
think they both have their own purpose.
Okay.
So think of usual status as like the wide angle lens.
Okay.
It captures someone's primary work activity over the past year. So it gives us a sense of the long-term trends.
Okay.
And then current weekly status kind of zooms in.
Okay.
And it captures those who worked at least 1 hour
Okay.
in the past 7 days. So it's like a snapshot.
Oh, so it's like the difference between the big picture
Yes.
and like what's happening right
the
now.
thing right now.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
So by combining them, we get a much more
A much more
comprehensive picture.
complete picture.
Yeah. Fascinating.
Yeah.
All right, let's
Yeah.
dive into some specifics here.
Okay.
What are we seeing overall
Yeah,
in
draw it.
terms of workforce
And-
participation?
Well, one of the most striking findings, I think, is the persistent gender gap. For example, in rural areas, over 65% of men aged 15 to 29 are
Sure.
working,
Oh.
compared to just under 40% of women
Wow.
in the same age group.
That's a huge difference.
Yeah, it's a really stark difference.
What do you think contributes to this?
So it's really hard to pinpoint one specific factor.
Okay.
It's a complex
Yeah.
interplay of social factors, cultural norms, economic factors. Often women have limited access to education and employment opportunities.
Okay.
And then you also have to think about things like affordable childcare and safe transportation. So all these things kind of play into this.
It's a whole web of...
It is. It's a whole web of interconnected factors.
So it makes you think about the individuals behind these numbers.
Right. Absolutely. Like all the stories, the numbers.
Yeah, all those individual stories
Take
aren't telling
stuff.
us.
Yeah.
And we're just looking at this cap.
Yeah.
And
it's
So what about just the overall trends in workforce participation,
okay.
regardless of gender?
So the overall increasing? Is it decreasing?
Labor force participation rate in India
Okay.
hovers at around 45%,
Okay.
which is comparatively low when we compare it to other developing economies.
Okay, so it's lower than other developing economies.
Yeah.
Interesting.
But what's really interesting is there's a lot of regional variation
Oh, okay.
within the country.
Okay.
So, for example, southern states like Kerala and Tamil Nadu, they have much higher participation rates.
Okay.
But then some northern states.
Oh, so it differs based on
Like behind the region.
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So geography plays a role.
Okay. And then
As well.
what about age?
Okay. So
Does the survey say anything about
yeah.
how age influences workforce participation?
So as you might expect, participation rates kind of peak among those 25 to 59
Okay.
prime working age,
Makes sense.
pretty much globally.
Yeah.
But what's interesting in India
Yeah, okay.
is that we see a decline in participation rates after the age of 50, which is a little earlier than in many developed
Much earlier.
It happens a little earlier.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I wonder if it has to do with like cultural expectations around retirement.
Yeah.
Or if it's like a lack of social safety nets
Yeah.
for older adults.
It could be the availability of social security systems as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a really interesting trend.
Yeah. And I think before we move on from this section,
Okay.
I want to ask you, what really stands out to you about these numbers?
I think the early decline in workforce participation, I think that's really interesting to me. because I think it could indicate that maybe we need to look at retirement policies, examine social security systems in supporting an aging population.
Yeah.
Are there opportunities for reskilling? You know, can these older workers continue employment if they want to?
Yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
So it's like a deeper investigation.
It's a lot of questions.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on.
Okay.
Let's look at the link between education and employment.
All right.
How does the level of education impact someone's job prospects in India?
So the survey shows pretty clearly that higher education levels generally translate to higher employment rates.
Okay.
So if you have a secondary education or higher,
Yeah.
you have significantly better chances of finding employment than those with only primary or no schooling.
Okay.
That's super surprising.
Not particularly surprising.
But it's good to see the data.
Yeah.
It's good to see.
Backing it up. Well, confirmation.
But I am curious.
Yeah.
Were there any maybe unexpected trends?
Outliers or anything like that?
Yeah, that emerged from the survey related to this.
Yeah, there's actually a worrying trend that the report highlights. So while higher education generally leads to better employment outcomes, there's this trend of educated unemployment.
Oh, interesting.
Particularly among young people with college degrees.
So even having a degree doesn't guarantee
a job.
A job in India today.
Which is a little bit concerning.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think is contributing to that?
So it seems like there's a potential mismatch between the skills that graduates are acquiring and what the labor market is actually demanding.
Okay.
So
like a skills gap.
A potential skills gap.
Gotcha.
And it makes us question the quality of education.
Yeah.
Is it adequately preparing young people for the workforce? And this is
a global issue, right?
Kind of a global issue, too.
And it's a global challenge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on, let's talk about the formal versus informal sectors in India.
All right.
What did the report uncover about that divide?
Yeah, what did they find there?
So this is key to understanding India's workforce.
Okay.
A large majority of Indian workers, over 80%, are employed in the informal sector.
Okay, so informal over formal.
Yeah.
Okay.
Now, for those of us...
And just to clarify, what's the difference between...
What are we even talking about here?
Yeah.
What sets them apart?
So the formal sector, you're looking at jobs with regular wages, benefits, social security protections. Typically, these are found in larger companies or government institutions.
That makes sense.
Whereas the informal sector, that's where you see a lot of self-employment, casual labor, small unregistered businesses. And often, there is little to no job security or benefits.
So we're talking street vendors, domestic workers, small-scale farmers, things like that.
Yeah, those kinds of things.
So a majority of Indians are working.
Yeah, a huge proportion.
Less secure, less regulated jobs.
Yeah. And this obviously has major implications for things like income inequality, access to social safety nets, worker rights.
Definitely makes you wonder about the overall economic well-being.
It raises a lot of questions.
A large segment of the population.
Oh, absolutely.
All right, listeners, we've covered a lot of ground so far.
We have.
We've talked about workforce participation, the impact of education, and that huge presence of the informal sector in India.
Yeah.
But there's more to come.
There is.
Up next, we're going to delve into earnings hours worked and what the unemployment picture looks like in India.
Right.
So stay tuned.
Looking forward to it. So welcome back to our deep dive into India's labor force survey.
Yeah, I'm ready to keep digging.
I'm particularly eager to get into the earnings data.
Me too.
That's where we can really start to see.
Yeah, what are people actually making in India?
Yeah, so let's get into that.
Okay.
One of the most striking findings is the gender pay gap. And this is across all sectors, really.
Oh, wow.
The report actually says that in the regular wage salary category, men's average monthly earnings were about 18,000 rupees.
Okay.
While women earned around 12,000.
So that's like a third less.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a big difference.
It is.
Why do you think that is?
Well, again, it's never one simple answer.
Yeah.
It's a lot of different factors all kind of interweaving and working together, but things that play a role are definitely occupational segregation.
Okay.
We see women often concentrated in those lower-paying sectors.
Fine.
Also, societal expectations and a lack of access to childcare.
Okay.
These things can limit women's career advancement opportunities.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously, if they can't advance their careers,
Yeah, they're not going to
earn as much.
be making as much.
Exactly.
Right.
So,
So it's this whole, these interconnected issues.
It's all connected.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to location then.
Okay.
Are there big differences between rural and urban areas when it comes to earnings?
Absolutely. So urban workers tend to earn considerably more than their rural counterparts.
Yeah, that makes
It's probably due to
sense.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I would guess.
Yeah, I think it's what most people
Yeah.
expect. And it's likely due to the higher concentration of higher paying jobs being in those cities.
Okay, but then you have to think about cost of living too, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Which is going to be higher in cities as well.
Exactly. Cities also have a higher cost of living.
So, I'm just thinking about those people in rural areas.
Right.
Are they able to make ends meet
Yeah. Are they able to
despite those lower wages?
survive, essentially?
Yeah. Is there anything in the report about that?
So the report doesn't address quality of life directly,
Okay.
but it does highlight that there is a significant proportion of rural workers in that informal sector.
Right, right.
And we know that the informal sector has those issues with lack of job security, social protections.
Right.
So it does suggest that economic vulnerability is a really pressing concern
Yeah, it definitely does.
in rural India.
Okay, so we've got the gender pay gap, we've got the urban-rural earnings gap.
Uh-huh.
What about earnings based on the type of employment?
Okay.
How do regular wage earners compare with those who are self-employed?
Yeah, so there are definitely differences there, too.
Good.
Regular wage salary earners tend to have the highest average earnings,
Okay.
followed by self-employed and then casual laborers,
Yeah.
kind of at the bottom.
So in general, the more stable and formal the employment,
Right.
the better the pay.
Yeah, generally speaking.
But I imagine there's got to be some exceptions to that.
Well, and the report acknowledges that it points out that
Okay.
you do have some highly skilled, self-employed individuals and
Okay.
entrepreneurs who are earning more
Okay.
than regular wage earners.
Interesting.
And it also mentions that sometimes you have casual laborers,
Okay.
particularly those with some specialized skills in high demand.
Okay.
They can actually end up making quite a bit because demand exceeds supply.
So it's not always cut and dry,
No,
formal versus informal.
it's not black and white.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move on to hours worked.
Okay.
How much time are people in India putting in each week?
So working hours vary a lot
Okay.
across the different types of employment.
Okay.
Self-employed individuals often work very long hours, like sometimes exceeding 50 hours a week.
Oh.
Whereas casual laborers might actually struggle
Oh, interesting.
to find consistent work.
Okay.
So they might work fewer hours.
So you're not making as much.
Right. And that leads to...
Some instability.
And you're also not working as many hours.
Exactly.
So it's kind of a double whammy.
Yeah.
So is there anything in the report that kind of says,
Yeah.
like, are people working overtime
Voluntary or
because they want to?
or are they being forced to?
Yeah, that's a good question.
Yeah.
So the report doesn't actually delve into the reasons
Okay.
behind the long working hours.
Okay.
But it does raise concerns about potential exploitation, particularly in that informal sector where we know labor regulations are weak.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that definitely makes sense.
Yeah.
All right, so let's move on to the big one.
Right.
Unemployment.
Yes.
What does the report say about the unemployment situation in India?
Okay, so this is where the data, I think, gets really concerning. The overall unemployment rate is around 7%,
Okay.
but that number
Yeah, that's
masks some pretty significant variations.
low, but you're saying there's
Yeah.
more to it than that.
Exactly. So, for example, unemployment is much higher
Okay.
among young people,
Right.
particularly those in that 15-29 age group.
So we might have like a youth unemployment crisis on our hands.
Potentially.
Yeah.
Yeah, and, high youth unemployment.
Yeah.
It can lead to social unrest.
Right.
It can cause a sense of hopelessness,
Definitely.
stifle innovation, economic growth.
Yeah. I mean,
So, yeah.
it can really impact a society.
Absolutely.
Wow, okay. What about unemployment rates based on location?
Yeah.
So, yeah, or education level.
It's interesting because unemployment is generally higher
Okay.
in urban areas.
That's interesting because you think there would be more
You would think there'd be.
Opportunities in urban areas.
More opportunity, yeah.
Yeah.
But it's likely due to migration.
Oh, okay.
So you have a lot of job seekers moving from rural to urban.
So more competition.
Exactly. Increasing competition.
More jobs.
And then on top of that, we already talked about that educated unemployment.
Right.
So even those with higher education levels are having a hard time finding jobs that match their skills.
So it really is a very complex issue.
It's a complex issue with a lot of different factors.
Okay, so before we wrap this section up, the report also looks at employment across different social and religious groups.
Yes.
Can you talk about that a little?
Yeah, so the report provides a breakdown of labor force participation, worker population ratios, and unemployment rates for different social groups. So they look at scheduled castes, scheduled tribes, other backward classes, and they also look at it in terms of religion. It's Hinduism, Islam, Christianity, Sikhism.
So what does that data tell us?
Well, it's crucial because it helps us understand how different groups are faring in the labor market. And then from there, we can see what policies need to be implemented to address any disparities and promote inclusivity. What's really important to note is that certain groups, particularly scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, consistently face higher unemployment rates and lower labor force participation compared to other groups.
So just more evidence that there are inequalities.
Yeah, it really highlights those inequalities.
Within the labor market.
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So listeners, think about all the things we just talked about.
We've covered a lot.
We covered earnings, working hours, the complexities of unemployment, looking at the data across those social and religious groups. What really stood out to you? What was significant?
Take a moment to reflect.
Or surprising.
Yeah.
All right, welcome back to the Deep Dive. We've been really unpacking India's workforce with this periodic labor force survey.
It's been quite a journey through the data.
It really has. So I just want to touch on some of those key takeaways that we've talked about.
Yeah, what really stood out to you?
No, what really stood out to you?
I think what's fascinating is just the level of detail in this report.
Yeah.
I mean, they surveyed over 1.7 million people.
It's massive.
Yeah, it's a huge amount of data.
Yeah.
And we rarely see that in these kinds of studies. So
that gives us such a clear picture.
It's very clear.
Granular view.
Yeah. And one of the things that really stood out to me was that persistent gender gap.
Oh, absolutely.
In workforce participation.
Yeah. One of the biggest things.
I mean, we saw a 25 percentage point difference at least.
Yeah, it's huge.
Between men and women in rural areas.
Yeah, it's a real problem.
Yeah. Just in that 15 to 29 age group.
Yeah.
And it really shows those.
Yeah. And, you know, the
social and economic areas.
Has major implications.
Yeah. Not just for the women themselves. For the country's economy as a whole.
Yeah, they're really missing out on a big part of their potential workforce.
It really hinders growth and development.
So it seems like there's a huge need for policies that empower women, give them access to education skills training. And really address those discriminatory practices.
Yeah, we need to.
Holding them back.
Level the playing field.
Yeah. Okay, and then another thing
what else
that I thought was really interesting
stood out to you
was the earnings data.
Yeah.
Not only is there a gender pay gap, but we saw those differences based on location and type of employment.
Yeah. Urban workers earning more than rural workers.
And those informal jobs making more than in the informal sector.
Absolutely, which again just shows how much inequality there is.
Yeah, there's definitely some big concerns about income inequality in India. Yeah. And of course, we can't forget about...
And then there's unemployment.
Yeah, the unemployment situation.
Which is a big one.
Yeah, that overall rate seemed low.
Right, 7%.
But it doesn't tell the whole story.
Doesn't tell the whole story, no.
No. Because we've got that youth unemployment rate. Which is much higher.
Much higher, yes.
And then that growing trend of educated unemployment.
Right. Even those with degrees are struggling.
It seems like maybe there's a disconnect.
Disconnect between
the education system.
The education and the jobs.
And what jobs are actually out there.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that could have really long-term consequences.
Huge consequences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into India's labor force...
Okay.
It seems like we have...
I guess it's a lot to think about.
A lot to think about.
Yeah.
You know, the report's great.
Yeah.
It gives us all this data.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really answer the why.
It doesn't say why these things are happening.
It just shows what is happening.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so I think this is where our listeners come in.
Okay.
We've explored the data.
Yeah.
We've looked at some key trends.
Yes.
Now it's time to think about what's causing these patterns.
Yeah. What are the driving forces?
Yeah. Is it access to education?
Is it cultural norms?
Are cultural norms playing a role?
Government policies?
Are government policies doing enough?
Right.
These are tough questions,
Yeah.
and there's not always easy answers.
There aren't.
But by really thinking about this data and thinking critically about these issues,
Yeah.
I think we can all contribute to
I think so too.
understanding India's labor market.
Yes.
And its future.
And maybe we can find ways to create a better system.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for joining us on the Deep Dive.
Yeah. Thank you for listening.
Until next time, keep exploring.